Hey guys, AJ here, and welcome back to another weapon ranking. This time we're finally going to cover Ayaka now that all of her stats and multipliers are official and we have a better idea of what her rotations look like. We're going to be ranking a bunch of swords by their damage output and see how they perform at different refinements, at different Ayaka constellations from C0 to C6, as well as with and without external buffs. I'm also going to distinguish between Freeze Ayaka and Melt Ayaka, as well as between two different playstyles for each of these builds, one being the standard on-field sustained DPS playstyle, the other a QUICKSWAP playstyle. And even though I call it Melt Ayaka, what I actually mean is any Ayaka build that does not use the 4-piece Blizzard Strayer and that does not rely on freeze uptime. Losing 40% crit rate from the Cryo set has many implications for weapon choice, which is why it's worth making this distinction. So that's 4 separate weapon rankings already. There's going to be quite a bit of information in this video, so if you're looking for something specific, there are timestamps in the description, as always. But before you start jumping ahead, you may want to stick around for just a bit longer to learn about all the assumptions behind these calculations. As with all my other rankings, Ayaka and all weapons are assumed to be level 90. All artifacts are maxed out. Main stats are attack percent, cryo percent, and either crit rate or crit damage depending on the weapon. For artifact sets, I assume 4-piece Blizzard Strayer for Freeze Ayaka and 2 Blizzard Strayer and 2 Gladiators for Melt Ayaka. The substat distribution follows the same 15 out of 25 approach as always, meaning out of the 25 total upgrades you're given across 5 artifacts, 15 of those go into the desired DPS stats, attack percent, crit rate, and crit damage. Those substats are then shuffled for optimal damage output for each weapon. Talent levels are all assumed to be at level 8. To evaluate and compare weapon performance, I had to first define a DPS rotation for both playstyles that you can see on screen now. Ayaka's first passive was assumed to have 60% uptime for sustained at C0, 80% at C1 and above, and for QUICKSWAP it's at 100%. Ayaka's second passive was considered permanently active. The Cryo Resonance was considered active for Freeze Ayaka, but not for Melt Ayaka. As for Ayaka's Elemental Burst, sometimes you're going to hit everything, sometimes you're going to miss some. Giving it 100% accuracy would have been too optimistic in my opinion, so I assumed that 80% of ticks connect with their target, meaning 15 of the smaller ones plus the explosion at the end. As for weapon-specific assumptions, unless otherwise stated, Aquila procs once, Summit Shaper gets all 5 stacks on sustained, 2 on QUICKSWAP, both with 80% shield uptime, because if you do run this weapon, it only makes sense to bring a shielder. For the new Mistsplitter, it seems reasonable to assume 100% uptime on stacks 1 and 2, and 50% uptime on the third one. Skyward Blade gets 24 additional hits from its passive on sustained, and 8 on QUICKSWAP. The 10% attack speed boost is accounted for as well. Freedom gets a 60% uptime on its buff as it lasts 12 seconds on a 20-second cooldown. Iron Sting gets both stacks on sustained and 1 stack on QUICKSWAP. Blackcliff gets 1 stack at all times. Harbinger's passive is considered active. Royal Longsword gets a flat 3% crit rate bonus to account for its passive. The Ellie Flash passive is considered active. Prototype Rancour gets all 4 stacks on sustained and 1 on QUICKSWAP. And the Flute's passive procs twice during the sustained rotation and once during QUICKSWAP. And with all that small print out of the way, let's begin with probably the most common setup of C0 PERMAFREEZE Ayaka. Mistsplitter is unsurprisingly her best weapon, but Summit Shaper isn't too far behind if you can maintain a shield. Jade Cutter isn't as strong here because any crit rate above 100% is wasted, and with Jade Cutter it's very easy to overcap on crit rate because you're already getting so much crit rate from your Resonance and Artifact set. Because of that, it's only slightly better than Aquila, which is followed by Blackcliff, the highest ranking 4-star on the list, and free-to-play friendly as well. After that we have Freedom, but since the buff it provides is a team-wide buff, it makes more sense to give this weapon to any sword-wielding support unit and equip Ayaka with any other sword on this list instead. The Black Sword is the next best 4-star pick and a solid option overall, but it also bears the risk of overcapping on crit rate, and as you can see from the refinements, its passive isn't too impactful, because a lot of Ayaka's damage comes from her ultimate, plus her kit already gives a bunch of damage percent bonuses. Next up is the Royal Longsword, which is just a worse Blackcliff, followed by the Flute, then Harbinger of Dawn, which also overcaps on crit rate, and then the new Amenoma sword, which is the ultimate free-to-play weapon if you're unwilling to even touch your Star Glitter. It's also the first sword on this list that helps with energy, which makes it a good investment if you have none of the above weapons or you struggle with burst uptime. It's better than the Ally Flash, and after that we have Skyward Blade. Damage-wise, this weapon sadly isn't all that special, but that's partly because we're only looking at a single rotation. If this sword helps you get your burst back up by the time it comes off cooldown, then that's certainly better than dealing slightly more damage per rotation, but with unnecessary downtime in between bursts. After that we have the other two craftable swords, which are simply not as good as the new craftable Inazuma sword, and then lastly the 4-star energy recharge weapons. If you happen to fight an enemy that cannot be frozen but only cryo-afflicted, there's a drop-off in damage for obvious reasons, but you can see that all of the crit rate weapons are much better now because their stats don't go to waste any longer. Now let's have a look at some external buffs. If you decide to run Bennett, then you can refer to this chart, but in my opinion Bennett is better used elsewhere, so what you might want to be doing instead is run other attack buffs such as Thrilling Tales and for Noblesse. In either case, nothing really changes at the top of the list, with just a few minor changes among the middle of the pack. If you're running Kazuha, this is what happens with 900 Elemental Mastery. One interesting thing to note here is that Summit Shaper catches up because Kazuha's elemental damage buff does less for Mistsplitter, which already gives a bunch of elemental damage bonus. Now it turns out that constellations actually do not make any difference in terms of the ranking, but I'm showing them on screen now to give you an idea how much more damage Ayaka deals with each constellation. I'll be going into more detail on her constellations in another video though. Feel free to pause the video if you want to take a look at any specific constellation. But AJ, what about the combination of C3 Ayaka with 4 Noblesse, Kazuha, and a Bennett that gives 637 attack? If you want to know the answer to that, I suggest you get yourself a copy of the original spreadsheet and customize it to your needs, with your artifact stats, your buffs, your team setup, and so on. All changes you make within the calculator will be reflected in the chart in real time, so if you want to be absolutely sure you're picking the right weapon, I recommend you do that. Next up, let's take a look at the QUICKSWAP freeze. QUICKSWAP is viable because a large part of Ayaka's damage comes from her ultimate, and all of her constellations except C1 do a lot for this playstyle. This is certainly a more whale-friendly playstyle, but as long as you have units like Venti or Mona, you can also totally do it at C0. One thing you'll notice with QUICKSWAP setups is that weapons that need to wind up to be fully effective perform worse because there isn't much time for them to come online, so to speak. This is made worse by the fact that Ayaka's ultimate snapshots, so gaining any stacks afterwards won't increase your burst damage. You see this with Summit Shaper, there's simply no room to accumulate many stacks before you swap out again, as well as with many other weapons. Same procedure as last time, we're going to look at enemies that cannot be frozen next. You roughly see the same trends as before, then at Bennett's attack boost, Thrilling Tales and 4 Noblesse, and lastly Kazuha's buff. Here's how the ranking looks like at Ayaka's different constellations. And if there's one thing that stands out above the rest, it's that Mistsplitter is completely broken, especially in QUICKSWAP where Summit Shaper can't really compete anymore. So that is it for Freeze Ayaka. Now let's head over to Melt Ayaka. Losing 40% crit rate from Blizzard Straya means you need to get your crit rate the traditional way. And with that, the weapon ranking looks more like what you're used to for other units, with Black Sword and Jade Cutter being much stronger than what we saw just now. Mistsplitter is still rank 1 though, even with buffs, except with Kazuha, where it's overtaken slightly by Jade Cutter because of diminishing returns on the elemental damage bonus. Here's what it looks like at different constellations, and in summary we can say that if you're not going for Blizzard Strayer, you can totally go for your standard crit rate weapons as you would for any other DPS. Last but not least, let's have a quick look at QUICKSWAP Melt, if such a thing even exists. Summit Shaper and Co falling behind again, Jade Cutter trying to keep up with Mistsplitter, and at C6 they're pretty equal. Again, because of diminishing returns on the Mistsplitter, since C6 gives a 300% damage bonus on Ayaka's charged attack. I assume this was a lot of information in a very short span of time, but that's already it for Ayaka's weapon ranking. Again, if you didn't find an answer to your specific setup, I recommend you have a look at the calculator yourself and customize it to suit your own account. Link is in the description. If you have any questions, feedback, or suggestions as to how to make these sorts of rankings more digestible and understandable, I guess, please let me know by dropping a comment or contacting me on Discord. If you enjoy my content, please consider subscribing, and thank you as always for watching.